They doubled Cape Matabare very slowly. Humboldt determined as they sailed, the positions of Cayo del Don Cristoval, Cayo Flamenco, Cayo de Diego Perez, and Cayo de Piedras. He also employed himself in examining the influence in which the changes at the bottom of the sea produce on its temperature at the surface. Notwithstanding the small size of their bark and the boasted skill of their pilot, they often ran aground. The bottom being soft, there was no danger, but nonetheless at sunset near the pass of Don Cristoval, they preferred to lie at anchor. The first part of the night was beautifully serene. They saw an incalculable number of falling stars, all following one direction, opposite to that from whence the wind blew in the low regions of the atmosphere. The most absolute solitude prevailed in this spot, which in the time of Columbus was inhabited and frequented by great numbers of fishermen. The inhabitants of Cuba then employed a small fish to take the great sea turtles, the fisher fish, formerly employed by the Cubans, by means of a flattened disc on his head, furnished with suckers, fixed himself on the shell of the sea turtle, which was common in the narrow and winding channels of the bowers. The fish, says Columbus, will sooner suffer himself to be cut in pieces than let go the body to which he adheres. The Indians drew to the shore by the same cord, the fishermen and the turtle, when Gomara, and the learned secretary of the Emperor Charles V, Peter Martyr de Angera, promulgated in Europe this fact which they had learned from the companions of Columbus. It was received as a traveler's tale. There is indeed an air of the marvelous in the recital of de Angera, which belongs in these words. Exactly as we follow hares with greyhounds in the fields, so do the natives of Cuba take fishes with other fishes trained for that purpose. We now know from the ununited testimony of Rogers, Dampier, and Camerson that the artifice resorted to in the bowers to catch turtles is employed by the inhabitants of the eastern coast of Africa, near Cape Natal, at Mozambique, and at Madagascar, in Egypt, at San Domingo, and in the lakes of the Valley of Mexico. The method practiced for catching duck was as follows. Men, whose heads were covered with great calabashes pierced with holes, hid themselves in the water, and seized the birds by the feet. The Chinese from the remote antiquity have employed the cormorant, a bird of the pelican family, for fishing on the coast. Rings are fixed around the bird's neck to prevent him from swallowing his prey and fishing for himself. In the following degree of civilization, the sagacity of man is displayed in the stratagems of hunting and fishing. Nations who probably never had any communication with each other furnish the most striking analogies in the means they employ in exercising their empire over animals. It was 3 days before the travelers could leave this labyrinth of gardens and bowers. At night they lay at anchor. By day they visited the islands, or chains of rock. They were most easily accessible. One day while they were employed in herborizing on the Cayo Bonito, their sailors were searching among the rocks for lobsters. Disappointed at not finding lobsters there, they avenged themselves by climbing on the mangroves and making a dreadful slaughter of the young alacrachas, grouped in pairs in their nests with the want of foresight peculiar to the great pelagic bird. The alcatra builds its nest where several branches of trees unite together. Humboldt and Bonpland counted 4 or 5 nests on the same trunk of a mangrove. The young birds defended themselves valiantly with their enormous beaks, which were 6 or 7 inches long. The old ones hovered over their heads, making hoarse and plaintive cries. Blood streamed from the tops of the trees, for the sailors were armed with great sticks and cutlasses. In vain were they reproved for this cruelty, condemned to long obedience in the solitude of the seas. They felt pleasure in exercising a cruel tyranny over animals. When an occasion offered, the ground was covered with wounded birds struggling in death. At the arrival of the sailors, a profound calm prevailed in the secluded spot. When they left, everything seemed to say, "Man has passed this way." They sailed along the coast, keeping 2 or 3 miles distant from land. On the 13th, a little before sunset, they were opposite the mouth of Rio San Juan, which was dreaded by navigators on account of the innumerable quantity of mosquitoes and zancudos which filled the atmosphere. Humboldt passed a great part of the night on deck. The coast was dreary and desolate. Not a light announced a fisherman's hut. There was no village between Banapano and Trinidad, a distance of 50 leagues. Scarcely were there more than 2 or 3 farmyards containing hogs or cows. Yet in the time of Columbus, this territory was inhabited along the shore. When the ground is dug to make wells, or when torrents furrow the surface of the earth in floods, stone hatchets and copper utensils are often discovered. On the 14th, the travelers entered the Rio Guarabo, one of 2 ports in Trinidad de Cuba. To put on shore, the pilot of Banabano, who had steered them across the flats of the Bowers, though not without causing them to run aground several times. They also hoped to find a packet boat in this port, which would take them to Carthagena. Humboldt landed toward evening and placed boards azimuth's compass and the artificial horizon on the shore, with the purpose of observing the passage of some stars by the meridian. But they had scarcely begun their preparations when a party of traders who had dined on board a foreign ship recently arrived invited them to accompany them to the town. They requested the travelers to mount 2 by 2 on the same horse, and as the heat was excessive, their offer was accepted. The road leading to the port was brilliantly illuminated by phosphorescent insects. The grass that overspread the ground, the branches, and the foliage of the trees all shone with a reddish and movable light, which varied in its intensity to the will of the animal by which it was produced. It seemed as though the starry firmament reposed on the savannah. In the hut of the poorest inhabitants of the country, 15 of these insects placed in a calabash pierced with holes afforded sufficient light to search for anything during the night. To shake the calabash forcefully was all that was necessary to excite the animal to increase the intensity of the luminous discs situated on each side of its body. The people of the country remarked that calabashes filled with these phosphorescent insects were lanterns already lighted. They were, in fact, only extinguished by the sickness or death of the insects, which were easily fed with a little sugar cane. A young woman at Trinidad de Cuba told the travelers that during a long and difficult passage from the mainland, she always made use of the phosphorescence when she gave suck to her child at night. The captain of the ship would allow no other light on board for fear of corsairs. The travelers quitted Trinidad on the night of the 15th. The municipality caused them to be conducted to the mouth of Rio Guarbo in a fine carriage lined with old crimson damask. And to add to their confusion, an ecclesiastic, the poet of the place, habited in a suit of velvet, notwithstanding the heat of the climate. L. Celebrated in a sonnet their voyage to the Orinoco. On the morning of the 17th, they came within sight of the most eastern island of the group of the Lesser Caymans. As long as they were in sight of the island, sea turtles of extraordinary dimensions swam around their vessel. The abundance of these animals led Columbus to give the whole group of the Caymans the name of the rocks of the turtles. The sailors would have thrown themselves into the water to catch some of these animals, but the numerous sharks that accompanied them rendered the attempt too perilous. The sharks fixed their jaws on great iron hooks which were flung to them. These hooks were made very sharp for want of fish hooks with chains. They were tied to cords. The sharks were in this manner drawn up to half the length of their bodies, and the voyagers were surprised to see that those which had their mouths wounded and bleeding continued to seize the bait over and over again during several hours. The passage from the island of Cuba to the coast of South America terminated at the mouth of Rio Sinu, and it accompanied 16 days. The roadstead near Puerto del Zapote afforded bad anchorage, and in a rough sea, with a hard wind, the travelers found some difficulty in reaching the coast. Everything denoted that they had entered a wild region, rarely visited by strangers. A few scattered houses formed the village of Zapote. They found a great number of mariners assembled under a short sort of shed, all men of color who had descended the Rio Sinu in their barks to carry maize, bananas, poultry, and other provisions to the port of Carthagena. Their barks, which were from 50 to 80 feet long, belonged for the most part to the planters of Lorcia. The Zambos of Rio Sinu wearied the travelers with idle questions respecting the purpose of their voyage. Their books and the use of the instruments, they regarded them with mistrust, and to escape from their importunate curiosity, the travelers went to herborize the forest. Although it rained, the Zambos had endeavored, as usual, to alarm them by stories of boas, vipers, and the attack of jaguars. But during a long residence among the Caymana Indians of the Orinoco, the travelers were used to these exaggerations. Quitting the coast of Zapote covered with mangroves, they entered a forest remarkable for a great variety of palm trees. After an hour's walk, they found in a cleared spot several inhabitants employed in collecting palm tree wine. A dark tint of the Zambos formed a strong contrast with the appearance of a little man with light hair and a pale complexion, who seemed to take no share in the labor. Humboldt thought at first he was a sailor who had escaped from some North American vessel, but was soon undeceived. This fair-complexioned man was his countryman, born on the coast of the Baltic. He had served in the Danish Navy and had lived for several years in the upper part of the Rio Sinu, near Santa Cruz de Lorica. He had come to use the words of the loungers of the country, to see other lands and to roam about, nothing else. The sight of a man who could speak to him of his country seemed to have no attraction for him, and as he had almost forgotten German without being able to express himself clearly in Spanish, the conversation was not very animated. During the 5 years of his travels in Spanish America, Humboldt found only 2 opportunities of speaking his native language. The first Prussian he met was with a sailor from Mamel, who served on board a ship from Halifax, and who refused to make himself known till he had fired some musket shot on his boat. The second, the man he met at Rio Sinu, was very amicably disposed. Without answering his questions, he continued repeating with a smile that the country was hot and humid, that the houses in the town of Pomerania were finer than those of Santa Cruz de Lorica, and that if they remained in the forest, they would have the termination fever from which he had long suffered. The travelers had some difficulty in showing their gratitude to this man for his kind advice, for according to his somewhat aristocratic principles, a white man, where he barefooted, should never accept money in the presence of those vile colored people. Less distasteful than the European countrymen, the travelers saluted politely the group of men in color who were employed in drawing off into large calabashes the palm tree wine from the trunks of felled trees. They weighed anchor at the road of Zapote on the 27th. At sunrise, the sea was less stormy, and the weather rather warmer. Although the fury of the wind was undiminished, they saw on the north a succession of small cones of extraordinary form. As far as the Morro de Tigra, these cones were known by the name of Paps of Santaro, Tulu, Rincon, and Chichimar. The two latter were nearly the coast. The paps of Tulu rose in the middle of the savannas. There, from the trunks of the Tuluifera, balsamum was collected, the previous balsam of Tulu. In the savannas of Tulu, the travelers saw oxen and mules wandering half wild. In the archipelago of San Bernardo, they passed between the island of Salmanquilla and Cape Banqueron. They had scarcely quitted the Gulf of Morosquillo when the sea became so rough that the waves frequently washed over the deck of their little vessel. The captain sought in vain a sheltering place on the coast to the north of the village of Rincon. They cast anchor at 4 fathoms, but having discovered that they were lying over a reef of coral, they preferred the open sea. The winds having dropped during the night, they could only advance to the island of Arenas, where they anchored. The weather became stormy during the night. They again set sail on the morning of the 29th, hoping to be able to reach Boca Chica that day. The gale blew with extreme violence, and they were unable to proceed with their frail bark against the wind and the current, when by a false maneuver in setting the sails they had but 4 sailors, they were during some minutes in imminent danger. The captain, who was not a very bold mariner, decided to proceed further up the coast, and they took refuge, sheltered from the wind, in a nook of the island of Baru. There was to be an eclipse of the moon during the night, and the next day an occupation of a star in Virgo. The observation of the latter phenomenon might have been very important in determining the longitude of Carthagena. In vain, Humboldt urged the captain to allow one of his sailors to accompany him by land to the foot of Boca Chica, a distance of 5 miles. He objected on account of the wild state of the country, in which there was neither habitation nor path. A little incident, which might have rendered the expedition more fatal, justified the prudence of the captain. Humboldt and Bonpland went by moonlight to collect plants on the shore. As they approached the land, they saw a young negro issue from the thicket. He was quite naked, loaded with chains, and armed with a long knife. he invited them to land on a part of the beach covered with large mangroves, as being a spot where the surf did not break, and offered to conduct them to the interior of the island of Baru, if they would promise to give him some clothes. His cunning and wild appearance, the often repeated question whether they were Spaniards, and certain unintelligible words which he addressed to some of his companions who were concealed amongst the trees, inspired them with mistrust. These blacks were no doubt maroon negroes. Slaves escaped from prison. The party from the vessel were without arms. The negroes appeared to be more numerous as they were, and thinking that possibly they invited them to land with the desire of taking possession of their canoe, they thought it prudent to return on board. On the morning of the 30th, they doubled Puerto Llanatas and made for Boca Chica, the entrance of the port of Carthagena. From thence the distance was 7 or 8 miles to the anchorage near the town, and although they took a pilot to guide them, they repeatedly touched on the sandbanks. On landing, Humboldt learned with great satisfaction that the expedition appointed to take survey of the coast had not yet put to sea. This circumstance not only enabled him to ascertain the astronomical position of several towns on the shore, which had served him as points of departure in fixing chronometrically the longitude of the Llanos and the Orinoco, but also served to guide him with respect to the future direction of his journey to Peru. The passage from Carthagena to Portobello, and that of the isthmus by the Rio Charges and Cruces, were alike short and easy, but it was to be feared that they might stay long at Panama before they could find an opportunity of receding to Guayaquil. And in that case, the voyage on the Pacific would be extremely lingering, as they would have to sail against the contrary winds and currents.